Awesome. Christina is here. Is there anybody here that I haven't just mentioned? Aside from Bradley and myself. Well, I think that's that. I'm going to turn it over to you all.
Brad, do you just want me to jump in, or is there anything you'd like to say before we get started?
So really, I was going to echo a lot of the discussions that we were emailing about this morning. I think that the biggest thing that I can say is we're trying to help everybody with some organization. And so you'll see that link for that research folder. And we're keeping this up for the research subcommittee. And we're adding in a lot of the pertinent information. I was going to check to see, should we include some of our email chains in there as well? Just so it can be a clearinghouse for anybody on the research committee who wants to get more info. So in that folder, I've been doing some organization. We put in the 2015 survey, 2020 survey, and made a new folder for the 2021 survey where I saved that Word document that you sent to me today, because I figured that would be a big portion of this, and to help everybody kind of be on the same page, you can all reference it right through that link. We've got them set up so that you can always download it, but you guys can't make any changes to that. And that's on purpose to try to help limit who's editing a document. But we're working with each subcommittee to try and help build this together, because that's always one of the biggest things, like, hey, can you send me this again really quick? And then everybody will have access to that. Now, we'll see how I do it summarizing what you had sent earlier, Christina. I always appreciate this because I consider you our resident research expert. And the big aspect being, as we come forward, we want to take a look at who we're asking questions to and what we're trying to discern from the questions we're asking. And I tried to go backwards a little bit to give an idea of some of the bigger scale questions we asked. And so stop me if I get off track anywhere, Christina, but in 2015, we talked a lot about voter confidence. Are you confident in your ballot being counted, the process, that every vote gets counted, election results are accurate? We talked a bit about trust, which was something I thought was interesting. Do you trust your state officials? Do you trust your local officials, your tribal officials? We talked about barriers. Which of these impact if you vote? And so seeing some of those barriers. And then we also talked about practices, like how far would you be willing to go to a polling place? What do you want to see the county office focus on? And then in 2020, we really focused on a couple of areas. We hit a few of them, but we changed a bit. We talked about confidence. How confident are you in the process? But then we switched a lot to how we receive info. Where did you get info as these different groups and different demographics? Because we were trying to, within our office, gain information relevant to the outreach committee and see who's getting information where, how, and how can we help improve this to catch those that we are missing. So now, with the research subcommittee, our goal is to create a 2021 survey that looks at this cycle, being the municipal cycle. Who do we want to ask and what questions do we want to ask? Really focusing on, do we want to keep these repeating? I like the way you put them, those longitudinal questions across time, stating confidence to me would be a good area, but really boiling down to whom are we looking at very specifically, who do we want to survey this year out of this group of who we want to survey. And then as I was looking at it to prep for this meeting, I looked at it, depending on who we survey, what questions could we answer out of those that we want to answer? What do we want to know? So Christina put together a lot of the survey responses and questions together. They're in there in that format, and I can pull them up on the screen and hand it over to you if I did an okay job summarizing.
Yeah, Brad, that sounds great. And I think the biggest part for us to conceptually sort of wrap our heads around is the idea that we have a group of questions that we're going to ask every federal cycle, right? So presidential and midterm. And those are, we can use this last 2020 as sort of our baseline, even though it's not a really good baseline year because of COVID, but there's a lot of pieces there that we can draw from. So that's where those confidence questions that Brad was just talking about are based, right? So we tried those in 2016 and then in 2020 again. So that's one group. And we've talked about that consistently being registered voters, right? So folks that are likely voters, they're already registered, and so forth. The second piece, conceptual piece to think about is this interim year. I don't like calling it the off year because after talking with Nathan and Brad, I understand that's not, there's no such thing as an off year. But this is where we have an opportunity from this conversation with this group and from the outreach subcommittee. It's becoming evident that there's some interest in turnout, why people aren't voting, but maybe that are likely voters. So maybe we look at the people that drop off between the federal cycle and the local cycle to ask some of those questions. But we've talked about this a couple of times before, just to put a fine point on it. We don't want to ask registered voters why they're not voting. When we did that in 2016, it's like 2% of the sample. So we're not really using the time and the money spent on the research in an effective way. Does that provide some clarity, sort of overarching? Any nods or voices would be great. Okay, I'm looking at a picture of myself, which is a little bit scary.
Sorry, I'm trying to share my screen, but I did want to unmute really quickly because that was one of the big things that I looked at is, if you're specifically asking voters as to why you didn't vote and voters who voted in the last election, then it's very few that you're catching who didn't vote, especially at 90% turnout. Now, I think that barriers have become a big aspect that the EAC in general would like to explore. And I think that there might be a way to capture information about potential barriers similar to 2015, where we asked which of these impact if you vote in an election. But we get a lot better info from people who didn't vote and what barriers made them not vote if we ask people specifically who didn't vote why you didn't vote. Is that what you were saying?
Yeah, that asking why somebody maybe votes in the easier, right? The easy election, the election where somebody sends you the ballot in the mail already, as opposed to, a municipal election, or why somebody drops off, right? There's not the same national media coverage of Missoula's city council races as there are for the presidential election. Okay, with that being said, I wanted to see how this group felt about a couple of the pieces around the general themes. I think, this group, I don't think the best use of our time is to write survey questions, right? That the idea here is to get the ideas, the concepts, the themes that you're interested in, and then if the county contracts with the University of Montana again, that's when you get survey researchers like myself to put our minds to the paper and get that done. So just taking a look at other, like the general topics. And I'd like us to focus on the second part, the 2021 survey first. So this is the interim survey that we want to think about. We asked in the Google form for sort of what people were interested in, and we only had 5 responses, and some people didn't answer all the questions. So maybe you're on this call and you want to say something that you didn't get a chance to put in there. This is an excellent time to. So one of the questions, right, that we just talked about was why federal only? Why are people not voting in off your cycles? So barriers there, and in ranking those barriers in the level of importance. Are there issues around the barriers that this group thinks are important beyond sort of what we might naturally think of, right? Like paid postage, I didn't get registered to vote, I didn't, what concepts are related to the barriers piece that you're interested in knowing more about?
Uh, Christina, I've a thought. Since most, Bradley, what's the turnout for the interim elections? Or Nathan?
Our turnout here, let me pull it up, but I'd say it's about 40 to 50%, and I'll get you the right number as I'm pulling it up for
Okay,
you right
that's
now.
I was thinking 45 or 42, something like that. Is it more useful to ask people why they do vote and try to do a springboard from that? It struck me that some voters are motivated directly by an issue that they're passionate about, and if that's not on the ballot, maybe they don't vote. Some people, I'm sure all the present company included, vote just out of general sense of civic duty, and they vote every election. Maybe asking why they do vote would ultimately prove more useful than why they don't. What do you think, Christina?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And we asked a question about why people are motivated to vote. Bradley, did we do that in 2020 or is it 2016 that I'm thinking about?
Am I muted? We covered it in both years.
Okay. So civic duty, by and large, is the one that people say. And that's a concept, right? That's kind of hard for us to how do I make somebody feel more civically dutiful? Yeah. That's not something like postage that I can say, okay, Bradley, we've got great advice, which is pay for postage. But we could ask it from both directions. That's something that survey researchers do frequently to sort of check what people are saying against, themselves, their own biases.
It might offer, the civic duty aspect might offer a guide to how to structure the advertising. If you can, structure advertising such that it might stimulate that in respondents or people that are seeing the ads.
Excellent. I like that. And I like the idea too about issues, right? And I think that in the comment, I'm wondering if it was yours, Todd, where somebody had mentioned in the Google form, like voting somebody in or voting somebody out can be a motivator.
Yeah, that was my comment. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Will and Todd, I pulled them up. Last year was 32, so 2019. 2017 was 43, and a lot of that is mayor race, ballot issue. And so, it really depends, and that can be it, that voting somebody out, voting somebody in.
Mm-hmm. So it's 2017 was significantly more than 2019.
Exactly, almost 10 percentage points higher. Yeah. And I got a feeling, and we didn't survey, we didn't ask, but I think it relates kind of similar to that. It's the mayor race, and the mayor is a lot more of that figure than city council, who meet weekly and we don't know exactly what they do.
Right.
This is Shibu. I just want to say I really agree with Todd's perspective, and I put in my survey questions a little late. I just finished them just now, but I also added maybe to ask those regular voters what it was for them. What would they share with a non-regular voter that was the thing that clinches it for them. So I think that's an interesting track.
Great, and I did see that Rebecca had her hand up.
Yes. I just
sorry.
To repeat the 2017 percentage, and I apologize. I'm not sure if I returned my survey, so I will double check that.
So in 2017, it was 43% turnout, and in 2019, 32% turnout. So, yep, Todd, I agree with you. I think maybe we could look at those who did vote and why. And then I thought it was interesting because in 2015, and I keep coming back to this, Christina, let me know if I'm being too much. We did ask the question of what impacts if you vote. And the specifics around that were in question 10, which of the following impact if you vote in an election? Information on a candidate, lack of time, conflicts with work, location of a polling place, uncertain of voter registration status, infos like that that say these are potential barriers that could impact you. And as a voter who votes, they need they need more of this information to feel more confident. I don't know. I want this to be as effective as possible. So sometimes I wonder if asking somebody what if the reasons they don't vote when they do vote, maybe flipping it on its head like Todd recommended is better.
Yeah, Brad, that question, I remember having a conversation with the call center when we were doing the fielding, because so many people were like, well, I'm voting, because we were talking to registered voters. And so in my role on the EAC, I think it's important that we are effective with the funding that we have to do research, right? And not ask a sort of throwaway question. And so if we wanted to ask about why somebody didn't vote or doesn't vote, I think doing that drop-off list would be better. So we could ask something about, how do you choose what elections you vote in, or something like that.
Right, and allow the responses of those who do vote influence the way you reach out to the ones who don't. Mm-hmm.
So I always see this as kind of coming back to this big question of barriers. And I like barriers because barriers are really solid items that we can help people overcome. So we can say if our goal is to get the highest turnout we've ever had in a municipal election, these are our barriers, and how do we help overcome them? Well, if it's information about candidates, here's where you find information about candidates. I'm always gun shy around the county produced voter guide because it's the same reason they trust us so much that they want one, and that's providing one's the same thing that will degrade that trust. But really around the idea of if these are the things which help you influence which elections you'll vote on, let's do more of those, and we can help encourage more voting.
Great. One question that I had when I was thinking about our conversation today is what the interest from this group and from Bradley and from Nathan is around some of the pieces that are changing or have changed from the legislature. Is that something that you want to, like, a point in time feel about that we would do in 2021, knowing that it's not something we'll necessarily be repeating, but same day voter registration, FIPA 2.0. I guess I want to throw that into the hopper for a conversation on what folks are thinking about.
Also, what are the changes in laws regarding the mail? I mean, that's no longer an option now other than the municipal elections, right?
So mail ballot is available as currently. They did remove the governor's ability to change a federal election to a mail ballot under emergency powers. So really, that didn't change election laws. It changed the governor's emergency power ability. We really saw this as an impact from the pandemic, where the emergency powers extended by the governor allowed a federal election to be run as a mail ballot, where that has kind of been the standard election law in the state of Montana. And so it eliminates the exception, and it didn't change the rule, it eliminates the exception. And in elections, we always have an exception to that rule, and it is all federal elections are held as polling place elections, with the exception that the governor has emergency powers that can override those laws. And now the governor does not have those emergency powers to override those laws. So all federal elections are held as polling place, and emergency powers cannot be enacted as such.
Can you also do mail-in ballots? Or in other words, a polling place election, could you send out absentee ballots to everybody as long as you keep the polls open?
Absolutely. So anybody who signed up for an absentee ballot, 85% of Missoula would get that ballot in the mail, even with the polls open, as previously. The difference is that you just can't eliminate the polling places.
Right. Okay. But so you could send it to 100% of the registered voters, right?
only if they were requested a mail ballot. And
So
so,
they have to request it.
yep. And so to run, we can still run municipal elections, special district elections, school district elections by mail as we always have. But federal polling place elections have always been polling place. Just there was a special exception in 2020 and they removed that ability.
Yeah, okay. But you really don't have the capacity to mail to everybody, that even if they're not requested, even though you keep the polls open.
Yep, not in a federal. Exactly. Okay. And, you know, that point in time snapshot, that's been a big question for me because there's so much I want to know. And I flagged trust as one of the things we may want to look at for 2021. Now, I feel like everybody in the EAC lives and breathes elections and thinks a lot about the current areas, trust in the process, records request. You know, January 6th was one of the survey questions that was asked. And maybe there could be something to capture that point in time that, you know, coming out of a federal election cycle, what are your thoughts about these areas? Because when I saw trust, it was, do you trust your federal, state, local, and tribal officials? And I said, what about your elections office? Do you trust them? Well, we can get that question answered by confidence in the process. To me, those are pretty similar. But this point in time is sort of very similar to trust. And, you know, with some of these changes that are new to people here, there has been a large scale records request. There is no longer same day voter registration. Ballot interference protection rules need to be written by the Secretary of State's office. And voter IDs have changed substantially. Now, which of these will voters, if we're looking at registered voters who voted in the 2021 election, they're likely not going to be impacted by a change to voter ID laws because it'll be a mail ballot election. So they won't have that impact that states, no, my voter confirmation card can no longer be utilized. My student ID now needs another supplemental form of ID. However, they will likely notice any BIPA changes. They'll likely notice any changes to confidence in the process around legislature or other areas. And I like these snapshot in time. I really like this data to help us know what we can do better right now. And so I'm really not opposed to that, depending on what we would be looking at for that snapshot in time.
Brad, for my 2 cents, I think looking at the feedback that we received in the Google form and hearing the interest in sort of January 6th and the conversations this group has had already around confidence, I do think pulling out some of the questions we used in 2016 potentially around trust and reworking them, right? So in political science, we often ask like how much you like your local elected officials, your state elected officials, you know, Congress, and everybody likes their, you know, local representative and hates Congress. And I have had an operational thesis that this is the same for what's happening now with elections. Like people are gonna be like, yeah, I trust Missoula County elections, but that federal election system, which isn't really a thing, right? I don't trust that. And so I think you could get some really like positive feedback from people, but also have an opportunity to see if that has fluctuated since 2016. And then some of these point in time, it's a good point that some of them won't really be felt until the next federal election. And so maybe we just flag them and say that could be something that's put into the 2022 survey. But I do think some of these will be interesting to see. But I'll put a pin in that. That changes our audience, right? So we want to think about the sample, and if we want to, I guess that's the big question that I have for the group is, who do we want to be talking to this year, and what's the most important stuff for us to know? Because if it's why people aren't voting in off years, that's a different group than saying, you know, how did these changes in the law affect your experience?
Christina, then I have a question. what are the various selection criteria that are available?
Good question. We historically have used the registered voters list, and a conversation that Brad and Nathan and I had offline was that we could pull a comparative list of who voted in 2020 and who didn't vote in 2021 and use that group that is the non-voter in the off-cycle year, a random sample of them.
Mm-hmm.
There are other options that are available, but they're usually much more expensive things to do, like getting a population-based sample as opposed to a voter-based sample.
Mhm.
Are there any advantages to selecting by zip code? In other words, are there some precincts that behave traditionally in one way and some precincts that behave traditionally in another?
I don't know enough about that data at this level. Something that we've historically looked at is the urban, suburban, rural breakdown, because those are different, right? Different voters, different populations.
Yeah.
To think about zip code, there's a sampling strategy that you could develop to do that. I'm not sure what the advantages are at that level because I'm not familiar with the differences in their action based on zip code.
We don't really have a lot of zip codes in Missoula County anyway, so it's probably not a fine enough.
No, but if you wanted to get more detailed, you could go to precincts, wards, other, House districts, Senate district. I don't know how deep we want to go in that.
Okay, yeah.
Well, then I like looking at it as we can take our sample of registered voters and we could look at voters who voted or voters who didn't vote. And out of those groups, the voters who didn't vote can really tell you a lot about the barriers they faced and possibly where they got information around this. If we wanted to revisit, are we just not getting information to voters? Now, when we go through the survey questions, the voters who do vote, it's not for lack of information. And that's what we saw from the 2020 survey is they've gotten information, they know the deadlines. And is it that the voters who don't vote and we want to look for that information? If we look at voters who did vote, we have a different look at that confidence process because we've been asking voters who did vote, how confident are you in the process? We've been asking voters in 2020, how confident are you in the process? And we wouldn't necessarily have that same sample and same question to ask in 2021. How confident are you in the process? Because now we're looking at a different group of voters. Now, Christina, this is where when I say something that's totally wrong about how research works, you jump right in and let me know. But that was my big difference because I thought maybe if we went informally and we said with a Google survey similar to what Christina had sent out, we're not going to gain scientific information that we can use to compare year to year, but we can say, Nathan, I noticed that you voted in the 2020 presidential, but you didn't vote in this. I've got a 5-question email survey I can send you that talks about barriers that might have been a factor. And looking to do this survey through the university as of voters who voted and looking at what areas we're looking at, confidence, barriers, practices, information, or trust. And then possibly doing a smaller, less scientific survey to see if we can figure out that other info, because my hope is to have a really great data set over the course of a decade, 2 decades. And I don't know if asking people this election who didn't vote in the municipal changes that data set. And I think that's really a big question to Christina.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think there's a lot of opportunity in having the close contact with the voter that's voting in the federal and not in the municipal, and being able to say, especially this year, right? Like, what's going on? Was that a January 6th thing, right? So what were the barriers or some question around trust or belief in the process, something like that. And you could do that knowing that it's not a representative, like, statistical sample, I think you could collect really interesting information that could inform your decision making as an office, right? It could give you some of the pieces that you need to make decisions. I think we don't want to compare off year to federal years because it gets weird, right? So in some ways, then we have the opportunity to say we can split this out and say we're looking at confidence every 2 years in the cycle. Does that sort of address your question, Bradley?
Yeah, so we did ask it right after 2015 from the municipal cycle, and so we have confidence in voters in a municipal, we have confidence in voters in a general. And I really think the big difference is if we ask non-voters about confidence, is it even worth stacking that up next to the voters, even if we're looking at different sets? Or is that a different group that we should be comparing apples to apples?
I mean, apples to apples. And I think there could be a comparison that's made between non-voters' confidence and voters' confidence. We would just need to think about describing the data in a way that doesn't make it seem like it's a time series, right? So like we asked this year, and then we asked this year, and then we asked this year. This would be we asked this group, and then we asked this group. So we're comparing different samples together, and that's okay. We would just have to make that clear.
And that's more in how we would present this information out, the dashboard, if you will. Okay, so I'm back to the big question of, I can state through these questions in our conversation here, barriers is something we want to know about. I like Todd and Shibu's recommendation of asking voters what made them vote, what helped them overcome barriers, and what they might tell somebody else, like that, to dovetail off of Shibu. What would you tell somebody who's right on the fence that would help them vote in this election? And then if we did that, we're looking at the group of registered voters who voted in this election, and we know we're looking at barriers. And I like the idea of looking at trust too. So we could do confidence, barriers, and trust. And those are our three big questions. Are you confident in the process? Similar questions to the previous years. And then we have 2015 to 2021. And then barriers, which is it's similar to questions we've asked before, but it's a little more of a point in time. And it can help us capture that. And then trust can be straight out of 2015. In 2015, we asked about trust in the process, and we can mirror that question, update that to look at it, and include your county elections compared to other areas, and between confidence in the process and confidence in the county, that can help us get an interesting viewpoint.
Sorry, Todd, go for it.
Yeah, just to add to that, the very concept of a barrier presupposes some sort of inclination to vote to begin with. And I think we also want to capture people that aren't inclined to vote and find out why. Because there's a lot of stuff that the parties can do and your office to maybe motivate people that don't have the motivation. So barriers is a good concept, but it probably leaves a lot of people. I mean, trust, I guess, in one sense you can say lack of trust is a barrier, but it also is a demotivator. And a demotivator strikes me as being different than a barrier, like distance to the polls or trying to get registered, et cetera, et cetera. That was all I wanted to add. Thank you.
Looks like Susan's got her hand up.
Yeah, I was wondering isn't 2020 kind of an anomaly? I mean, there was so much heated stuff flying around, as well as having a pandemic in there, and then the aftermath was even uglier. So how do you factor that in? A lot of people may have gone out and voted in the high turnout because it was so fraught with emotion. Mm-hmm. And how do we convert that emotion to civic responsibility?
That's a really great question, and I think we can't at this point because we don't really know what will happen in 2022. All the political science election people that I hang around with are talking about how, at first 2016 we talked about as being an anomaly because so many people turned out to vote and the election results. And then 2018 saw even more. And then 2020, like everybody got to vote by mail and all these things changed. And so for the last 3 federal cycles, at least, the field has been talking about this as being like, we don't know if this is a change in, our electorate or if it's just the craziness that's been going on. But Brad and Nathan and I and the team at have talked about the fact that, like, while we might want 2020 to be a baseline, it's going to be hard to make the case that it is, right? Because COVID and the presidential election and everything surrounding that just made it wacky.
And when we get to this dashboard to present this information, that's where we really flag. 2015 survey covers a municipal general directly before. This is a vote by mail. And guess what? 2020 covers a federal general. It was a vote by mail, which is not the norm. I mean, election laws had to be suspended in order to do this. That aspect that we're looking at, it makes it its own anomaly, but can we look at similar questions and have the same questions appear and then go year to year and say, are you confident in the process? And these were the unique items in that year. Yeah, remember that 2015 municipal? That was quite the year. That was when we had the open space bond. That was when we had this, which changes the way they go because no election is truly apples to apples. We've got our Gala apples to our Gala apples. We got Fuji's, there's a lot of different areas. And then there's the oranges where it's a federal presidential cycle, and that's not even an apple. But there might be other versions of that same orange. And the questions can I personally think it would be good to have some questions, specifically that confidence matrix remaining really similar. I was going to say stagnant, but I think similar is a better word for that, so that we can have those questions each time and say, then do these weird circumstances that revolved around this election change that?
Yeah, that's really great, Brad. And I'm going to use your apples to oranges, galas and Fuji's in class this week. One thing I wanted to just turn us back to revisiting is I see a tension between the confidence concept and the barriers concept based on the sample, in terms of if we're asking people about their confidence in the process, but they are non-voters, I'm not sure. I mean, we could ask those questions. I think there's some pieces we need to massage a little bit there. I don't want you to get in the position, Bradley and Nathan, where suddenly we're talking to a different group of people that is less confident because they didn't vote. So, right? Like, I don't want you to be in a place where it's all of a sudden feels bad or somebody's going to come at you with this information. The other is, I think that Todd's point's really interesting about barriers, right? Voter registration, that's a barrier. And so if we're sampling already from the voter list, the registrant list, we've already anticipated at least the ability to overcome registration. So we're not really getting the true picture of the non-participant, I guess. So I just want to set some boundaries around how we're talking about what we can learn from what groups. Does that make sense?
Yeah, because I kept coming back to that and thinking, well, if we do ask non-voters, we're getting a lot different answers on their confidence, what practices the office have, but we are getting good information on barriers and info. But also, if we're asking people whom are registered voters who didn't vote, we're getting different information than if we're asking people who never registered to vote. And I think for what I would prefer to see on this, and I'm looking for good information guidance and working together, is that we ask registered voters who do vote in each of the larger scale conducted surveys, or with another group if we utilize another group in the future. But we use registered voters who vote in that, and then dovetail that directly into something informal along the lines of, we have questions we're creating. Why don't we ask voters these same questions who don't vote? And maybe we're not surveying it in the same way, and we can't load it into our dashboard because the data is not quite the same, but we get a great idea of ways we can improve as the election office to help meet the EAC's goal of reaching out, being a liaison between the community and figuring out ways to better serve everyone. I just saw your hand go up, Susan, sorry.
Yeah, oh no, it was in comment to what you were saying, and I think some of what the outreach committee is working on as far as education and things like that would dovetail really nicely with what you were just saying.
Mm-hmm. And I think, you'll notice as we go through this, so many times we were just talking about the research committee and how it's going to play in with the outreach, or I'm sorry, recruitment with the outreach, research into the outreach, and then many of these areas that we're looking at, we're not even going to wait to survey to see if this is going to be helpful. We're just going to add it. Tour of the office, you bet. As we get up to the municipal primary, come and see all of our processes and work with outreach to advertise that. On the research, I think that would be really good. I don't want to overstep and start guiding you guys, but I do want to give you an idea of this overall framework that we're envisioning for the long term. And part of that is being able to load into this dashboard data. And we could have like a flip a switch between registered voters who vote and registered voters who don't vote. And it would show you different surveys at different times. But I like the idea of keeping that set as similar as possible and utilizing other alternatives for registered voters who don't vote. And we've done this in the past through the EAC, but we can, with this EAC, I'm certain we can grow it substantially.
I think that there's some really neat ways that you could facilitate communication exchange with people that are non-registered through some of the county resources like the water bill or other things, which we used to do for non-election related work in Cascade County back in the day. I think that would also, Brad, just to put a bee in your ear, be a great fellowship opportunity for somebody to put together a report for you on.
That's actually an interesting idea for outreach. If I mean, for the city, from the city's perspective, when they conduct the municipal election, they could notice that through their water bills. I mean, I love that idea, Christina.
I'm full of these wild ideas.
Yeah, well, speaking of someone who just paid their water bill.
So to jump back in, I think that the big question that's going to be the most helpful area to answer on this is, from the research subcommittee, what group are you looking at? If we were going to do a survey of voters this year, would we be looking at a group of registered voters who voted or registered voters who didn't vote? Because that's going to shape how we build out these questions quite a bit.
Mr. Travis, are we looking to gather data that we could compare to 2015? Are we looking to answer new questions or get a look at that group that didn't vote? What's the priority?
So again, our priority would be to kind of keep it similar, looking at that similar group. But amongst the committee, if you guys think that it would be worth it to look at another group, we do have the option of doing that informal survey. Or if you really feel that the best use of this would be to recommend to the commission and us that we want to survey non-voters in this one, I'm looking for a consensus from you guys, because I know that for us, that's the way I would run it. The whole reason you guys are here is because we want input. I don't want to just be leading, guiding, and making the decisions. We want to have a great open discussion about why and how.
Susan has her hand up. So does Rebecca.
I think Rebecca had her hand up prior. Go ahead.
So can you guys hear me?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. I think the focusing on the non-voters, and then secondarily the registered voters who don't vote, that's where I think I'm most interested in the why, personally.
Susan, did you have something you wanted to say?
Well, it's kind of a conundrum about whether we would want to do a formal survey with those who voted, because they would have a more practical approach to it, because they have voted, they know what the process has been and might have ideas. But on the flip side of that, those who have not voted, the curiosity is why. So it just depends on where you want the folks to be. If we improve what we're already doing with registered voters and then have a different avenue that we use for contacting those non-voters. And again, I think that's where recruitment and outreach might be the best avenue for approaching those folks from a more personal standpoint. I don't know.
Todd, I see your hand.
Yeah, I'm on an iPad. I've never used it before. I'm down in Southern California, so I just saw the hand down there. Sorry for butting in before. Is it expense that prevents you from interviewing both simultaneously? Like, did you vote, did you not vote, and set of questions A, set of questions B?
Yeah, so I could provide a little bit of a context about the how the sausage gets made in this. Non-engaged non-voter, so not registered, is the most expensive group for us to talk to because we don't have a list to draw from. So that's where when this idea of talking to people that voted in 2020 but not in 2021 came in, because maybe it's a splitting the difference between voters and non-voters, right? It's like a sometimes voter. So the non-voter is the most expensive group for us to talk to because we have to figure out how to get their information. We'd have to buy a list from an organization that provides those. We could run, of course, a simultaneous study. You'd have a bigger sample size, so the whole thing gets scaled up into sort of this level of expense that's really from the calling, like having to do phone dialing. That's what the expense is from. It's not from it's from having to use people to call and interview people over the phone. Does that help?
Well, I would assume that would also be the hard group to get fully completed surveys on. As I'm not a registered voter, I'm not a regular voter, and now you want to spend 15 minutes on the phone asking me questions about why I am or am not. And, when we get 600 responses, it's 600 completions throughout here with a good sample size. It's about $20,000. So I would feel that it would be exponentially more expensive for that. However, it is definitely another option to look at and give you a different set. And if the idea is from the EAC that they want to focus on barriers, that's the group to ask about barriers. It's hard to get a good answer, but it might be the most direct and best data we could get.
Yeah, in general, I feel that a lot of the data you're going to get from the non-voters is going to be suggestions or comments that are going to be difficult to act on or to address. And I feel like, going back to Todd's point earlier, you're going to get valuable information from the people who vote. If you can determine what motivates them, whether it be the civic duty or some people, my grandma told me to vote this year, or I like this candidate, or I want to vote this person out, etc. You can build on those kind of things and make a kind of movement or something to guide your materials or however we want to reach out through the outreach committee and things like that. I think you're going to have a more valuable response from the voting community than the non-voters. Todd, go ahead.
Yeah, I concur with that, because I think that gives you an insight into more general human nature than just getting the specific objections to this, that, or the other thing. I think they're both valuable, but in terms of long-term planning, probably the why do you vote may give you, a better foundation. So that's my thoughts on that. No, whoops, what am I doing there? Oh, sorry.
So we know we want to ask about barriers, and now we're kind of back to this idea of who are we looking at. And Rebecca, you're right there. I think that if we want to know about barriers, we got to ask people experiencing those barriers, and I think there can be good data to get there. I think that the ability for that data to build into this dashboard and sample survey that shows confidence over time and other issues like trust and practices that we're looking at may not be as robust, but an individual survey, I mean, if we reached out and sent them an email and said, hey, all we need you to do is reply with a phone number and we will call you and ask you these questions. I mean, we could set that up pretty easy to send out a survey to voters from the county of people who didn't vote, ask them their barriers. Now, it does not catch us, those who never registered. And the outreach committee had talked a lot about that on saying, are there other areas where we can have more information sharing, partnership health center, other areas like that, where other people who aren't registered and vote may show up, but not participate, and we can gain info from there or something similar. I think that's my biggest question is, I know we want to look at barriers in there, possibly how you receive info, and who do we want to ask. And I feel like it would behoove us to ask registered voters and do a smaller survey of others. I just want to make sure that I'm not pushing it out. And I feel like Todd says, yes, we can get that info. Shibu, when he was on, said, yeah, you can even take that one step further. I think, Rebecca, we can catch some of those people with this individual offline survey of, hey, call us and we'll walk through and gain this info. Susan, you put your hand up and I just kept talking. What do you have?
That's okay. Mike, I just have a question for you. If you could, for your definition, what do you mean when you say barriers? Can you define that for us?
Yeah, something that would make it harder for you to vote. A barrier to voting in the election. So barriers could be a lot of different things. They could be your access to a stamp. We had a lot of survey questions that covered them. In 2015, number 10 was impact if you vote. That's the best example of them all. And that one is to give a list of what we've already asked. There's not enough information on candidates, lack of time, conflict with work, location of polling places, uncertain of voter registration status, paying for stamps, transportation, uncertain of election date, or other items. And so that's what I was looking at around barriers is, what impacts if you vote in an election? What makes it harder for you to vote in an election?
So just to put a fine point on this in our last minute, I think that if we can craft a really meaningful question, asking that of people that voted in 2020 but not in 2021, that can get some of that information about low frequency voting as opposed to, disengaged population. And I have some ideas about how you might do outreach to the group of how do we find out from people that are just not part of the system, and would be happy to work with you on that and how we could think about a way to host that on a county website and make all that work.
Yep. And here's where I sit. I'm hearing you guys say we want to talk to voters who didn't vote. They're going to give us the best barriers. Non-registered voters is going to be the hardest to come up with. But that list of voters who voted in 2020 and didn't vote in 2021 can give us great information. And I do think that they can talk to their confidence in the process, trust, some election practices, and still explain what the barriers were that caused them not to vote in the 2021 municipal, so that we can help eliminate those for future elections to get as many people voting in every election. What are you thinking, Travis? Were you trying to say something there?
No, I just coughed.
Oh, no worries. I mean, and I'm changing where I'm at. I was like, let's talk registered voters who voted. But if this is our big point, that we want to overcome barriers for 2022 cycle, we'll need the data from 2021 that explains what some barriers are. Now, they're differing in a municipal to a point. I think some can be pretty, if it's information on candidates, it's a barrier. It's information on candidates in a general and a municipal, and in a different way in a municipal. But I think we can gain good info from that.
I want to sit with this idea overnight.
Yeah.
I like to think about it, but I have some notes from our conversation today, and it's been really helpful to illuminate sort of where our interest and focus is, and sort of, now I see 3 nodes, right? One is our group of people that aren't part of the system. One's a group of people that are low frequency, and one's sort of like the person that's already voting in the municipal election is like the least likely for us to need to address their barriers, right? Because they're already voting in probably everything.
Yeah. What barriers are we going to address to the voter who votes in the municipals, the schools, and PS anytime that Lolo has an election? I'm there too. And what if we do just a quick follow-up survey? Ping everybody and say, this is what we're looking at. We want to see confidence. We want to see barriers. We want to look at trust and practices. We'll come up with questions out of the whole EAC, because I know Denver wanted to be a part of this conversation, and dang it, he got to go on a vacation, and there are others who are participating too. We can just get a look from the whole, and we'll bring that back together for Nathan, myself, as well as my bosses, the commissioners, to kind of take a look at and see. Because the reality with this is, yes, I want you guys to be as engaged as possible, but we also want to work through and hit the items that are important also to the commission.
Mm-hmm.
I've got quite a good few notes. I appreciate these conversations so much.
Just wanted to thank Christina for putting all that together and parsing that data. Thank you.
It's what I love to do. Well, I really appreciate everybody taking the time out of their schedule to talk through this. This is, I always tell students, I'm teaching research methods right now, that it's always a team project. You always work with others. Part of research is always coming back to the points that we're making sure we still feel good about them. So I can, Brad and Nathan, if you want me to set up that sort of same sort of form that we can send out to the whole EAC. Okay, I can get that over to you later this week.
Yeah, that's great. I can do one of those too, but I always prefer that we keep them all housed in one place. So that'd be fantastic. Anything else, don't hesitate to shoot an email follow-up. We'll record this, we'll get this out, do a little follow-up and a link to this so we can all remember what we were chatting about. And then as we come forward to the main committee as a whole, we'll do just kind of a little report back that we're still shaping them up. This is what we're looking at, and we're nailing down our big questions. Who are we going to ask, and what do we want to know?
Cool.
Good seeing everyone.
Thanks all.
Bye-bye.
Bye.